And before this video begins, I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asbantium level patron, Fallon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. At the start of Game of Thrones, House Baratheon is essentially the most powerful house in all of Westeros. You have King Robert, the beloved war hero, his 3 children and his 2 brothers, meaning the house and the succession is very safe and secure. Robert's marriage to Cersei Lannister, daughter of the richest house in Westeros, seems to solidify this really powerful nature, but by the end of just season 5 of the show, every trueborn Baratheon is dead, with the entire house all but extinct at the end of the show, save a singular bastard child who fortunately gets legitimized. I mean, he deserves it after all the running and rowing he had to do. I've always been fascinated by House Baratheon, how relatively young it was as a noble house, and how quickly it all crumbled down before our very eyes, with all 3 branches going extinct like their Durrandon forebears. Of course, this is all purely show canon at the moment, since in the books there are still a number of Baratheons alive, especially the book-only Edric Storm and Maya Stone. But today I wanted to take a look at the history and, well, tragedy of House Baratheon, the youngest of the great houses and seemingly a cursed one at that. By this point, we obviously all associate the Stormlands and Storm's End with the Baratheons, but that wasn't always the case. Unlike the ancient Starks, Tullys, Arryns, or many other great houses who built their own seats, the Baratheons claimed Storm's End through conquest. You see, during the Age of Heroes, the Storm Kings of House Durrandon dominated eastern Westeros, with Storm's End built by the founder, Duran Gosgrief. The Durrandons are a story for another time, but by the time Aegon the Conqueror landed in Westeros, the Storm Kings were already a fraction of the dominant power they once were. Led by the aging and faded King Argilac, they defied Aegon Targaryen, offended by Aegon's offer for his close friend and rumoured half-brother Orys Baratheon to marry Argilac's daughter Argella Durrandon. The king believed his daughter would be dishonoured by marrying a bastard, so he refused and took up arms against the conqueror. Argilac the Arrogant, as Fire and Blood names him, took on the army of Orys and Rhaenys Targaryen with favourable numbers, but the battle known as the Last Storm ultimately went the same way as many during the conquest, because even though the Durrandon outnumbered their enemy, they didn't have a dragon, obviously. Orys managed to defeat Argilac in one-on-one combat, killing the Storm King and winning the battle. Argella tried to brand herself as the Storm Queen, but her garrison revolted, handing her over to Orys. Interestingly, according to Fire and Blood at least, Orys was very respectful to Argella when she was delivered to him. When Aegon granted Orys the Stormlands and Storm's End, Orys took the young woman as his wife, and even adopted the Durrandon words and sigil as a way to honour King Argilac's valour and legacy. And that's how House Baratheon was formed, only 300 years before Game of Thrones, with a noble, chivalrous warrior honouring his fallen foe. And trust me, that doesn't happen too often within this world. As I mentioned, Orys Baratheon was a close friend of Aegon Targaryen, the first Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and King of Westeros. It was heavily rumoured they were half-brothers, and Orys was often considered Aegon's only true friend, which led to him becoming the first Hand of the King. He was a great warrior in general, but the failed conquest of Dorne took a lot out of Orys, including his dominant hand, which changed him into a bitter man obsessed with a revenge he finally achieved 30 years later before dying from his wounds after battle. However, House Baratheon was secure with his son Davos, forming a strong line that would continue for the next 2 centuries with significant ties to the Targaryens, keeping that bond between the families long after the deaths of both Aegon and Orys. However, that almost all came crumbling down with Rhaegar Baratheon, the grandson of Orys and protector of the realm during the regency of King Jaehaerys I. Now, I won't get into all the chaos of Targaryen succession here, but things were incredibly messy during the reign of King Maegor the Cruel. Lord Rhaegar protected the Dowager Queen between Alyssa Velaryon and her children Jaehaerys and Alysanne, ultimately leading a rebellion against Maegor and winning the throne for Jaehaerys before becoming his hand and regent. He was basically Jaehaerys' adopted father and eventually became his actual stepfather, but this was one of the many reasons their relationship began to fall apart, including the main reason of Jaehaerys marrying his sister, which was obviously a forbidden thing to do in Westeros, even though Targaryens loved doing it. Rhaegar, a follower of the Faith of the Seven, was one of the many people outraged by this marriage, and many people considered him the true ruler of the realm due to Jaehaerys still not being old enough, so a coup was definitely a potential outcome, especially as Rhaegar's persistent attempts at undoing the king's secret marriage failed. It got so bad actually that Rhaegar tried to get the small council to send Jaehaerys away to become a maester and replace him with his niece Arya. This got him kicked off the council, and his outburst at Alyssa ruined their marriage. So Rhaegar then attempted a full-scale usurping, only for this scheme to fail and Lord Baratheon finally yielded when Jaehaerys became old enough to rule. Jaehaerys actually pardoned Rhaegar and convinced him to become his fiercest and most loyal champion because, you know, he literally showed him a dragon and said, "Hey, yeah, this thing can kill people if they're not nice to me." And Rhaegar got the message. However, Alyssa died during the birth of her and Rhaegar's second child, causing some tensions once again. Ultimately, despite everything, Rhaegar maintained his promise as Jaehaerys' champion, even marching to Dorne to defeat his own brother Boris, who was raiding the Stormlands with the outlaw Vulture King. Ultimately, Rhaegar managed to maintain the honour of House Baratheon, but that only lasted until everything blew up in the Dance of the Dragons, when we meet Rhaegar's grandson, the cowardly Boros Baratheon. So remember earlier when I mentioned those close ties between the Targaryens and Baratheons? Well, one of those marriages led to Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, or the Queen Who Never Was. So when the civil war regarding Viserys' succession broke out, it was assumed Boros Baratheon would support the cause of Rhaenyra, who was allied with Rhaenys. But he actually welcomed the Greens with open arms, believing the would-be queen had taken advantage of the Baratheons for too long, so he was happy to ally himself with Aegon's cause instead. And now I'm gonna get into current and potential future spoilers for House of the Dragon, so skip here if you don't want those. What followed was obviously the confrontation at Storm's End, which we see in House of the Dragon, leading to the death of Lucerys Velaryon. Right, so you may have been wondering why I called Boros a coward, and that's because he basically just didn't bother to fight in the dance, despite declaring for the Greens. When he called his banners and gathered a 6,000 strong army, he didn't use it to fight Rhaenyra. He instead went to fight a Vulture King down in Dorne instead, only actually bothering to get involved after Rhaenyra's death, liberating an already rebelling King's Landing full of peasant kings. He basically didn't take any actual heroic risks and just went for the easy wins. It is true that Boros was able to take the cities of Rosby, Stokeworth and Duskendale, but then Boros underestimated the lads of the Riverlands and got completely destroyed at the Battle of the King's Road, which was an objective, humiliating disaster for Boros, who had half his forces crushed and the other half turn against him. And on top of all of that, he got killed by a literal Muppet, with Kermit Tully ending him during the battle. Of course, Boros took many men down with him, including the heads of both House Darry and Mallister, but considering the strength of the Baratheon host compared to that of the Riverlands, it was definitely an embarrassing defeat. And if his wife Elenda hadn't given birth to a son the week later, it could have ended the entire line of male Baratheons right then and there. So yeah, Boros is definitely up there with the worst of Baratheons. Okay, so that's the end of House of the Dragon spoiler territory, since we don't know much of what happened to the Baratheons after the war. But they managed to rebuild their strength, and the famous knight Stormbreaker brought glory to the house once more. But then we get to Lionel Baratheon, and I'm sorry to do this to you again, but potential spoilers for a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. I know, back-to-back book-based spoilers, I'm sorry, I have to do it. Anyway, Sir Lionel Baratheon was a very powerful warrior, and one of the small folks' favourites in tournaments. Known as the Laughing Storm, Lionel was very respected and became an ally of Sir Duncan the Tall and Prince Aegon, especially when the latter became king in 233 AC. The Targaryen-Baratheon bond was as tight as ever when Aegon betrothed his son and heir to the throne, Duncan the Small, to Lord Lionel's daughter. But for once, it wasn't actually the Baratheon side that broke everything here. When Prince Duncan was in the Riverlands, he met and fell in love with the peasant woman Jenny of Oldstones, a strange girl who claimed to be descended from the long extinct kings of the First Men. Duncan married Jenny and willingly gave up his rights to the Iron Throne. This obviously very much offended Lionel for understandable reasons, because it had been promised. And also, on a meta level, this decision ended up one of the most significant butterflies leading to King Aerys II, who only gained power due to his father suddenly becoming heir because of Duncan's marriage. Anyway, Lionel swore an oath of vengeance and crowned himself Storm King, rebelling against the throne. From the little we know, this rebellion was short yet bloody, and it only ended when Sir Duncan the Tall defeated Lionel in single combat. Aegon V then arranged for his daughter Rhaelle to marry Lyonel's heir Ormond, and everyone lived happily ever after. Well, obviously not really. At least we're out of show spoiler territory for good now. So Duncan's refusal to give up Jenny of Oldstones not only led to the crowning of the Mad King, it also led to the birth of one Robert Baratheon, the same man who would ultimately usurp the Targaryen rule. So I suppose it could be said that Lionel Baratheon's oath of vengeance never truly went away, but it could also be said that the house became cursed. Ormond inherited Storm's End and even became Hand of the King to Jaehaerys II after the tragedy of Summerhall, but he died early on in the War of the Ninepenny Kings, being killed by Maelys the Monstrous, the last known Blackfire, a rogue branch of the Targaryen family, continuing to show this perpetual dance between the two. Ormond and Rhaelle had just one known son, Steffon, who married Cassana Estamon and had the 3 Baratheons we meet in A Game of Thrones. When he was young, Steffon was close with the Prince Aerys Targaryen and Tywin Lannister, but things grew more sour when they were all older, with King Aerys II growing paranoid of Tywin, his hand. Steffon was sent to Volantis to find a bride for Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the heir to the Iron Throne. However, this journey would be his last, with a young Robert and Stannis watching as their parent ship was torn to pieces in a storm off the coast of Storm's End. It almost feels like some sort of twisted divine intervention that Steffon and Cassana were claimed by the storm, since Steffon might have been the only person capable of keeping King Aerys from descending fully into madness. And yet it was Aerys' own command that sent Steffon on his doomed voyage to begin with, meaning that, in a way, it was yet another Baratheon being killed due to the actions and command of a Targaryen. But this time, it would be a death that would ultimately break the bonds between these families forevermore. We all know the story of Robert Baratheon by this point, because as he always likes to remind us, gods, he was strong back then. Robert grew up in the Vale of Arryn alongside Eddard Stark, becoming like brothers under the foster care of Lord Jon Arryn, who became a father figure to them. Robert was just 16 when he became Lord of Storm's End, whilst his slightly younger brother Stannis remained isolated and in his shadow, growing ever resentful of his brothers who received all the attention. Robert grew infatuated with Ned's sister Lyanna, and they were betrothed, despite her not caring much for him and his womanizing ways. When Prince Rhaegar seemingly kidnapped Lyanna, Robert's rebellion began, with the story we're all familiar with. Ned became Lord of Winterfell and joined his close friend in the rebellion, fighting the king's loyalists across Westeros, while Stannis Baratheon managed to withstand the siege of Storm's End for almost an entire year. Despite this incredible feat, Robert once again gained all the glory thanks to the Battle of the Trident, where he killed Rhaegar, a reversal of the usual Baratheons dying because of Targaryens. Robert ultimately became King of Westeros, the first non-Targaryen king in the United Realms history, although given the two families' close ties, it seems fitting, especially since Robert himself was a quarter Targaryen thanks to his grandmother. However, Robert, much like his ancestor Lionel, remained bloodthirsty for revenge against the Targaryens, almost completely wiping out the former ruling dynasty. It was Stannis who was charged with this final destruction, assaulting Dragonstone but unable to kill Viserys and Daenerys due to them being smuggled out of the fortress. This failure continued to drive a wedge between the brothers, especially when Stannis was given Dragonstone instead of Storm's End, which was granted to the young Renly, despite Stannis, the second oldest and heir, having the right to the fortress now that Robert was king. Robert's reign began with the Greyjoy Rebellion being swatted aside and peace returning to the continent. With the king marrying Cersei Lannister and producing heirs, he grew complacent and fat, whilst Stannis helped Jon Arryn truly rule the kingdom, feeling ignored and unappreciated by his brother. Even when Jon Arryn died, Stannis expected to be named the new Hand of the King. But Robert instead chose Ned all the way in the north, the final fatal blow in the relationship between the brothers, with Stannis leaving for Dragonstone with most of the royal fleet, whilst Renly sat on the small council as Master of Laws. What followed was the disastrous short-lived tenure of Ned Stark as Hand of the King, with the Lord of the North unravelling the mystery of Robert's children and the king dying in a convenient hunting accident, leaving his firstborn heir Joffrey to ascend to the throne. Robert Baratheon was not a good king. On the surface, he was, with an era of peace and prosperity apparently descending on Westeros. But in truth, he wasn't cut out to be king, leaving everything up to his council whilst he drank and slept around, blind to the plots against him because he still believed he was the war hero everyone loved and respected. It's no surprise that Robert's reign crumbled the way it did. Such a king is not a sustainable ruler, but the manner of how the wider Baratheon line collapsed with his death is astonishing. However, the signs were actually there from the beginning, and it was actually all his fault, a negligence that wiped out his entire family after his own mysterious death. When Robert dies, Stannis is the true heir to the Iron Throne, since Joffrey is an illegitimate child born to Jaime and Cersei Lannister. He's not actually Joffrey Baratheon, he's Joffrey Hill, but no one actually knows that apart from Ned, who is dead, Jon Arryn, who is also dead, and Stannis Baratheon, who has very few political allies. Even Renly refuses to support Stannis' cause, instead crowning himself as king. This has always been very stupid and short-sighted to me, because Stannis is already on the older side and only has a daughter, so Renly would be his heir anyway, meaning they would both get to be king at some point. But a lifetime of bitterness has made that impossible. Of course, there is also the book-only Edric Storm, but I'll talk about him later. Stannis and Renly are dead ends for the Baratheon line even before the War of the Five Kings. Stannis only has a sickly daughter who Westeros would never accept as a queen, and Renly is a closeted gay man who can't conceive an heir with Margaery Tyrell. Of course, sometimes it is possible for gay men to have legitimate children with women, but Renly is assassinated by his brother very early on in the war, so he doesn't even really get the chance to try. Remember, there is an outcome possible where Renly, who has the biggest army, joins forces with Stannis, who has the best claim, and Robb Stark, who only wants justice for his father and for the North to be independent. I'll probably cover this in depth on its own someday, but the decisions made both during and after the reign of Robert Baratheon really doomed the entire house because of how these children were raised, or the way they weren't raised. They never had a sense of kinship and love for one another. They were all raised separately and with different lifestyles and forced ambitions, so they never felt a loyalty to one another. If Robert had been a better brother to Stannis, things might have been different, but they also would have been different if Stannis and Renly were closer brothers. But the relationship and rivalry between Stannis and Renly was so fierce that the elder Baratheon had the younger killed, before he himself later died in the north in the battle for Winterfell. So with this, the entire house dies, especially when Joffrey, Tommen and Myrcella also die in quick succession. Even if they weren't real Baratheons, it's still the official extinction of the entire Baratheon line to the histories of Westeros. And like I said, it's a very sudden fall considering how secure they seemed at the beginning. With the death of Stannis Baratheon, the House of Baratheon becomes a house of bastards. King Joffrey and King Tommen Baratheon are lions in stag coats, but even they are unable to remain on the throne and fall to the plotting and scheming of those around them. But even so, in some sort of cruel twist of fate, Robert's misrule actually managed to keep the Baratheon line alive, even if it's by the thinnest of margins. Like I already mentioned, Robert had a lot of bastard children all across Westeros because he slept with any woman who had a pulse. And if he was able to find Lyanna after her death, probably even those without them. Even though Joffrey had almost all of these bastards killed, there are still notable characters like Gendry in the show, and in the books, Edric Storm and Maya Stone. Edric is really interesting, having been conceived on Stannis' wedding night, with the mother being Delaena Floren. Due to her being a noblewoman, Edric was acknowledged, although this doesn't make him legitimized, like Ramsay Bolton for example. Edric remains a bastard, but in the books, he takes on a lot of the storylines Gendry had in the show, like his blood being used to kill Stannis' rivals, before being smuggled out of Dragonstone and sent to Essos to hide. Edric is known as Robert's child, so if Stannis dies in the Winds of Winter, that leaves Edric as the next logical heir to the throne on the Baratheon line. Of course, he'd have to fight Aegon, Jon Snow, Daenerys, and King Tommen for the throne at that point, but winds will never come out, so we don't have to worry about it. However, in the show, Gendry is the main Baratheon bastard, eventually being legitimized by Daenerys Targaryen after the Battle of Winterfell, being granted Storm's End and appointed as Warden of the South. It's rather fitting given the storied history between the families. Aegon the Conqueror granted Orys Baratheon Storm's End during his conquest, starting the Baratheon house. And almost 300 years later, it's another Targaryen conqueror giving their ally Storm's End and resurrecting the Baratheon house by legitimizing him as Gendry Baratheon. But in the gap between Renly's death and Gendry's ascension, Storm's End sits empty and unclaimed, with no clear Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. There's a big power vacuum the show never acknowledges, and the books haven't had to acknowledge yet. In my opinion, it's likely that this vacuum would have been filled shortly after the Battle of the Blackwater, with Storm's End empty and undefended as Stannis flees. A lot of Stannis' Stormland forces were captured and swore fealty after the defeat, most prominently House Swan, the second most powerful house in the Stormlands. Other possibilities include House Penrose, House Buckler, and House Stedman, all houses that became loyal to Joffrey, and therefore Tommen and Cersei after him. In order to stabilise a region, it's best to appoint a ruling family who is already established, like the Boltons being given control of the North, meaning one of these Stormland houses would have no doubt been declared Lord Paramount, either being given Storm's End or having their seat become the new centre of power for the Stormlands. Of course, in the books, the Pretender King Aegon takes Storm's End with the Golden Company and his close ally Jon Connington, who himself is the exiled head of one of the most powerful houses in the Stormlands, meaning he would be the favourite for the seat of Storm's End or rule of the region if Aegon succeeds in his claim as rightful heir to Aerys' throne. A region like the Stormlands would not be left unruled for long, so by the time Gendry is legitimised and given Storm's End, there'd likely be a different ruling family of the region who dispute his rights to take their titles from them, especially due to him being given the power by a short-lived and assassinated Targaryen tyrant. So Gendry's rule as Lord of House Baratheon would not be a smooth one to begin with, because he would have to prevent rebellions from more powerful, established and purely noble families with better claims to owning the Stormlands. I suppose it's not unlike William the Conqueror, for example, whose claim to Normandy was heavily disputed due to his own illegitimate birth. Obviously, things worked out for him, but it's not always something guaranteed, especially without spilling blood. Therefore, even with the 11th hour survival of House Baratheon, their story is still very tragic and their future uncertain. The story of the Baratheons is one of honour and family loyalty twisting into one of betrayal, ignorance, complacence, and in the very end, a lot of luck. There's no doubt that Gendry earned his legitimization with his actions during the show, especially with all that rowing. But as a Baratheon and Warden of the South, he stands on shaky ground with a lot of political enemies, especially since he's not exactly best friends forever with the creepy soulless King Bran. He's just friends with his sister, who he doesn't really care about either. Westeros doesn't look fondly upon bastards, even if they're legitimized as lords, so there would definitely be many who question being ruled by a bastard of a king whose line died out. For better or for worse, the Baratheons' existence has always been defined by Targaryens, with the former ruling dynasty responsible for so much death and glory for the house founded by, if the rumours are true, their own blood. So it would be interesting to think of how, if at all, the Baratheons managed to continue in a world truly without Targaryens. The story of House Baratheon is full of heroes like Orys, who pledged to continue the honourable legacy of the Durandons, but it's also full of villains like Borys, who raided his own people, and cowards like Boros, who tried to skirt around a war he pledged to fight in. And last of all, its new legacy is that of a house of bastards thanks to King Robert Baratheon, who single-handedly made his own dynasty collapse before it could even begin. Every major Westerosi house has had its share of misfortune, betrayal and death, but I think few compared to just how tragic and relatively short-lived House Baratheon was. How quickly they rose and how quickly they fell into near extinction with no clear future ahead. But anyway, that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you want me to do more dives into houses like this, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to give an extra special thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Platinum level patron Matthew Burns, and all my Gold level patrons Chris Douglas, Daniel Shillito, and the 3 Railway Engines. Thank you so much for your support.